The phone rings at 3 a.m. It's never good news at 3 in the morning. Not for a man who controls the quiet, brutal underbelly of the city. A late-night call usually means blood on the pavement, or a shipment seized by the feds, or one of his captains dead in a ditch with his throat cut. Dmitry Volkov didn't expect the deadpan voice of a desk sergeant. He certainly didn't expect the name of the inmate using his one phone call. His secretary. The man who color-coded his schedule, brewed his coffee at precisely the right temperature, and had never once raised his voice in 3 years of employment. Leo Chen was sitting in a downtown holding cell. And he wanted Dmitry. Dmitry Volkov did not sleep. He took brief tactical pauses of unconsciousness, usually ending before the sun came up, his alpha instincts keeping him perpetually on edge even in the deepest hours of night. When the encrypted burner phone on his nightstand vibrated against the mahogany, his eyes snapped open. The digital clock read 3:04 a.m. He didn't scramble. He sat up, the heavy silk sheets falling away from his chest, and answered on the second ring. He expected the harsh, clipped voice of his lieutenant reporting a disaster at the docks. "Volkov," he said. His voice was gravel, stripped of any inflection. "Yeah, is this Dmitry Volkov?" The voice on the other end was nasal, bored, chewing through the vowels like cheap gum. "I'm calling from the 12th precinct. Got a John Doe here who finally gave us a name and a contact. Says you're his employer." Dmitry went perfectly still. The 12th precinct. He ran through a mental ledger of his men. None of them were stupid enough to give the cops Dmitry's direct number. None of them would dare. "Who is it?" "Name's Leo Chen. Booked on aggravated assault and disturbing the peace. Bail set, but he refused a lawyer. Just said to call this number." "Leo." Dmitry stared at the blank wall across his bedroom. Leo Chen. His secretary. The young Omega who had spent the last 3 years organizing his life with terrifying quiet efficiency. Leo wore sensible gray slacks and pressed white button-downs. Leo bought him black coffee exactly 4 minutes before he walked into the office, always with a single sugar, never cream. Leo filed offshore banking documents with the same grim expression he used to order printer toner. Leo did not get arrested for aggravated assault. Leo did not get arrested for anything. The Omega was so meticulously controlled, so perfectly contained, that Dmitry had sometimes wondered if the man possessed a pulse at all. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Dmitry said. He hung up. The city was drowning in a cold, relentless autumn rain when Dmitry's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the 12th. Ivan, his driver and head of security, kept the engine running. The heavy silence in the car spoke volumes. Ivan hadn't asked questions, but Dmitry could feel the Alpha's confusion radiating off him like heat. Dmitry stepped out into the downpour, ignoring the umbrella Ivan offered. The cold water felt appropriate. It matched the sudden, sharp shift in his reality. His Omega, not his, not officially, but his in every way that mattered, was in a cage. The precinct smelled exactly the way a police station at 3:30 a.m. always smelled: damp wool, stale burnt coffee, ammonia, and human desperation. Underneath it all, Dmitry caught the faint, acrid residue of fear and anxiety pheromones from the various detainees. His alpha instincts bristled. Dmitry pushed through the heavy glass doors. His tailored charcoal suit felt like armor in the fluorescent purgatory of the waiting room. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller. His dark hair was cropped short, his jaw sharp enough to cut glass, and his eyes were the pale gray of a winter sky just before a blizzard. A desk sergeant sat behind thick, scratched plexiglass, typing slowly with 2 fingers. "I'm here for Leo Chen," Dmitry said. His tone was low enough that the sergeant had to stop typing and look up. The cop sized him up, the suit, the watch, the absolute lack of movement in Dimitri's posture. Cops knew when they were looking at money, and they knew when they were looking at danger. Dimitri was both. The faint, oppressive weight of his alpha pheromones filled the space around him, making the sergeant instinctively straighten in his chair. "You his lawyer?" the sergeant asked, pulling a clipboard closer. "I'm his employer." "The bail?" $5 grand, cash or bond?" Dimitri pulled a sleek, black money clip from his interior pocket. He counted out $50 bills and slid them through the narrow slot under the glass. "Process it." The wait took 12 minutes. Dimitri didn't sit on the plastic chairs. He stood by the wall, watching the hallway that led back to the holding cells. He was trying to construct a scenario where Leo Chen, his quiet, reserved, impeccably professional Omega secretary, found himself in a street brawl. His imagination, usually capable of picturing the worst violence humanity had to offer, completely failed him. Then the heavy metal door clicked and swung open. A female officer walked out, leading him. Dimitri felt a strange, tight pull in the center of his chest. The bond he'd never acknowledged, the connection he'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist, suddenly roared to life. It was Leo. But it wasn't the Leo he saw every day at 8 a.m. His hair, usually pulled back in a severe, unforgiving clasp at the nape of his neck, had come loose, falling in damp, chaotic waves around his shoulders. He was wearing his standard white button-down, but the top 3 buttons were torn off, revealing a bruised collarbone and the flushed, irritated skin of his throat. His jacket was missing. But it was his hands that caught Dimitri's attention. His right hand was wrapped in crude, bloody gauze, the knuckles swollen to twice their size. And then Dimitri caught it, the scent. The faint, sweet, familiar scent of Leo's Omega pheromones, usually so carefully suppressed with scent blockers and sheer willpower, was flooding the air around him. It was laced with pain, with exhaustion, with something that made Dimitri's alpha instincts roar to life with terrifying intensity. Underneath it all, there was the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Leo stopped when he saw Dimitri. His dark eyes, usually completely unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses, flickered. There was no shame in his gaze. No tears. Just a tired, flat acknowledgement. He didn't look like an Omega who had just been bailed out by the head of a criminal syndicate. He looked like an employee annoyed that he had to work overtime. "Mr. Volkov," he said. His voice was raspy. Dimitri closed the distance between them. He stood over Leo, his presence suffocating, blocking out the cops and the glare of the lights. He looked down at his secretary's bleeding knuckles, then up to the faint swelling on his left cheekbone. "Leo," Dimitri said quietly, the word carrying a dangerous edge. "Are you going to tell me why I'm buying you out of a cage at 4 in the morning?" Leo looked down at his ruined hand, then back up at Dimitri. "It was a disagreement." "A disagreement," Dimitri repeated, his voice dropping an octave. The alpha in him was pacing, snarling, demanding answers. "Yes." Leo adjusted the torn collar of his shirt, a futile gesture of modesty. "Can we leave? The coffee here is a violation of human rights." Dimitri stared at him for a long, heavy second. He realized he didn't know the man standing in front of him at all. He'd seen the glasses, the efficient manner, the controlled scent. He'd never seen the steel underneath. He turned to the desk sergeant, grabbed the release paperwork, and looked back at Leo. Cars outside. The rain hammered against the roof of the SUV, a chaotic drumbeat that filled the heavy silence. Ivan navigated the slick, deserted downtown streets with practiced ease, keeping his eyes firmly locked on the road ahead. The glass partition separating the front from the back was up. Leo sat as far away from Dimitri as the leather bench seat allowed. He was staring out the window at the blurred streetlights, his bleeding hand resting lightly on his knee. He was shivering, though he was trying very hard to hide it. Dmitri watched him. He had spent his entire life reading people, alphas, betas, omegas, it didn't matter. He survived by knowing exactly what a man was going to do 3 seconds before he did it. He looked for tells, a twitch, a shift in breathing, a break in eye contact. Leo gave him nothing. He was a locked vault. But his scent was screaming. Dmitri unbuttoned his suit jacket, took it off, and tossed it across the seat. It landed next to Leo. Put it on. Leo glanced at the jacket, the expensive wool still carrying Dmitri's heat and the warm, commanding scent of his alpha pheromones. I'm fine, Mr. Volkov. You're shaking, Leo. Put the jacket on. That's an order. Leo tightened his jaw, a subtle flex of defiance. But he picked up the coat and draped it over his shoulders. He looked small inside it, swallowed up by the dark fabric. He stopped trembling almost immediately, his omega instincts responding to the alpha scent surrounding him. Talk, Dmitri said. He leaned back against the leather, his arms crossed. Leo kept his eyes on the window. I went to a bar. The neon sign said they had good gin. The neon sign was lying. Don't play with me, Leo. Aggravated assault. You put a man in the hospital. The sergeant told me while you were signing out. Broken orbital bone, shattered jaw, and a concussion. They said you used an ashtray. It was a heavy ashtray. Leo. His name was a warning. Leo finally turned to look at him. In the passing flashes of the streetlights, the bruising on his cheek looked darker, angrier. A man approached me at the bar. He was persistent. I politely declined his company. He decided polite wasn't an answer he wanted to accept. Dmitri felt a cold, jagged spike of anger lodge itself in his ribs. The scent of his own alpha pheromones flared, sharp and territorial, filling the car. He touched you. He grabbed my arm. Leo gestured vaguely to his torn collar. Tried to pull me out the back door. Said he was going to show me a good time whether I was in the mood or not. So you beat him half to death. I hit him until he stopped holding on to me. Leo corrected, his voice deadpan. He just happened to hold on for a remarkably long time. Dmitri let out a slow, controlled breath. He was accustomed to violence. He orchestrated it. He paid for it. But hearing this Omega, who reminded him when to send his mother flowers, who meticulously redacted his financial ledgers, who always smelled of calm control, described bludgeoning a man with clinical detachment sent a strange shockwave through his system. Why didn't you call the police? Dmitri asked. Leo let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. It was a sound Dmitri had never heard from him. The police, Mr. Volkov? You of all people know how the police handle an Omega complaining about an alpha at a bar. By the time they arrived, I would have been in an alley. I handled it. You handled it. Yes. Dmitri leaned forward, closing the space between them. He reached out and gently, deliberately took Leo's injured hand. The Omega flinched instinctively, trying to pull back, but Dmitri's grip was firm. The contact sent a spark of something electric through both of them. Leo's scent sweetened, just slightly, before he ruthlessly suppressed it. Dmitri looked at the crude gauze the precinct nurse had slapped on Leo's knuckles. Blood was already seeping through the cheap white cotton. You don't know how to throw a punch, Dmitri muttered, inspecting the swelling. You hit him with the wrong part of your hand. You're going to have hairline fractures in your ring and pinky fingers. I'll type with my thumbs on Monday, Leo replied without missing a beat. Dmitri's eyes snapped up to Leo's. They were mere inches apart. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't looking at his secretary. He was looking at a survivor. Someone who operated on the same grim, pragmatic frequency he did. The realization was profound and incredibly dangerous. Who was he? Dmitri asked softly. Leo hesitated. His gaze dropped to Dimitri's hands holding his. Does it matter? If he's a nobody, you wouldn't be avoiding my eyes. Dmitri squeezed Leo's wrist, just enough to demand his attention. Who was he, Leo? Leo swallowed hard. He recognized me. Or rather, he recognized who I work for. When I told him to back off, he laughed. He said he worked for the Moretti crew. He said taking Volkov's little Omega secretary for a ride would be a nice bonus for his week. Dmitri went completely rigid. The Moretti crew. They were a mid-level outfit currently pushing into his territory on the south side. They were a nuisance he had been planning to deal with next month. They had touched his Omega. They had used his name while doing it. The air in the SUV dropped 10 degrees. Dimitri's alpha pheromones flooded the space, dark and furious, the scent of an apex predator about to strike. Leo's breath hitched, his own Omega instincts responding to the display of raw, possessive power. Dmitri let go of Leo's hand and leaned back, pulling out his burner phone. His face was an absolute void. It was the face men saw right before their lives ended. What are you doing? Leo asked, the first hint of genuine alarm creeping into his voice. Making a call. Don't. Dmitri froze, his thumb hovering over the keypad. Leo had never used his first name. Not once in 3 years. It felt strange in his mouth, intimate and raw. The way his Omega voice wrapped around the syllables made Dimitri's alpha ache. Don't what? Dmitri asked, his voice a dangerous whisper. Don't turn this into a war. I took care of it. I left him bleeding on the floor. It's done. It's not done until I say it's done. Dmitri replied, the mob boss finally bleeding through the veneer of the businessman. He put his hands on what's mine. The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded. What's mine? Leo stared at him, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. The boundary between employer and employee had just been shattered, ground into glass dust and scattered onto the floorboards of the car. Dmitri dialed the phone. Ivan, he called out to the front seat. We aren't going to Leo's apartment. We're going to the penthouse. Call the private doctor. Tell him to meet us there. The private elevator to the top floor of the Volkov Tower hummed with a low, expensive vibration. It was the only sound in the confined space. Dmitri stood near the control panel, his posture rigid. Leo stood in the opposite corner, still swallowed by Dimitri's charcoal suit jacket. He stared straight ahead at the brushed steel doors. In the confined space, Leo's scent was overwhelming. The pain, the fear, the exhaustion, it all rolled off him in waves. And underneath it, something else. Something that made Dimitri's alpha instinct stand at attention. It was faint, but it was there, the sweet, warm undertone of an Omega in distress, calling out for comfort, for protection. Dmitri watched Leo's reflection in the metal doors. He noticed the way the Omega subtly shifted his weight off his left leg, the slight grimace he failed to suppress. The bastard at the bar had done more than just grab his arm. The doors chimed and parted, revealing the penthouse. It was a vast, sprawling space of cold minimalism. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city skyline, a jagged expanse of black and neon weeping under the relentless rain. The furniture was low-slung, dark leather and gunmetal gray. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress with a view. Sit, Dmitri said, pointing to a long leather sofa in the center of the room. Leo didn't argue. He walked over and sank into the cushions, his injured hand resting awkwardly on his lap. Dimitri walked to a heavy mahogany wet bar, poured 2 fingers of scotch into a crystal glass, and carried it over to him. "Drink," he ordered. Leo took the glass with his good hand. He didn't sip it. He threw it back like it was medicine, handing the empty glass back to Dimitri without a word. The alcohol hit his system, and his sense softened slightly, the sharp edges of pain dulling. The soft chime of the service elevator echoed through the room. Ivan walked in, followed closely by a thin, balding man carrying a scuffed leather medical bag. Dr. Thomas Evans was a man who asked no questions, charged exorbitant fees, and never documented his late-night house calls. "Dimitri." Dr. Evans nodded, setting his bag on the glass coffee table. He looked at Leo, his professional mask slipping for a fraction of a second in surprise. He was used to patching up heavily tattooed Alpha enforcers with bullet wounds. Not an Omega in torn office attire. "His right hand," Dimitri said, his voice flat. "And check his ribs. He's favoring his left side." Leo shot Dimitri a sharp look. He hadn't said a word about his ribs. Dimitri ignored his glare. "Let's take a look," Evans murmured, pulling up a low stool. Dimitri did not leave the room. He stood a few feet away, leaning against the edge of a heavy oak desk, his arms crossed over his chest. He watched intently as Evans unwrapped the crude, blood-soaked gauze the police nurse had applied. Under the harsh light of the modern chandelier, the damage was ugly. The skin across Leo's knuckles was split and peeling back, the flesh swollen and colored in angry shades of purple and black. Evans probed the joints with gloved fingers. Leo sucked in a sharp breath through his teeth, his good hand gripping the leather of the sofa. But he didn't make a sound. His scent, however, spiked with pain, and Dimitri's alpha instincts roared in response. Dimitri felt a muscle in his jaw jump. He wanted to tell the doctor to be careful. He wanted to break something. The violence humming under his skin was a familiar companion, but the protective, territorial edge attached to it was entirely new. Hairline fracture on the 4th metacarpal, Dr. Evans concluded, reaching into his bag for antiseptic and a splint. And the skin is badly macerated. You hit something hard. A skull, Leo said simply. Evans paused, looked up at him, then back down at his hand. Right. Well, it's going to hurt for a while. I need to clean these abrasions thoroughly. It will sting. Go ahead. Dimitri watched Leo's face as the doctor applied the iodine. The Omega's eyes watered, but he kept his jaw locked tight. He was tougher than half the men on Dimitri's payroll. For 3 years, he had been a ghost in Dimitri's periphery, a highly efficient, quiet ghost who managed his chaotic life with zero friction. Dimitri realized with a cold jolt of clarity that he had never actually looked at him. He had seen the gray slacks, the glasses, the severe hair. He had never seen the steel underneath. Let me see the ribs, Evans said, finishing the bandage on Leo's hand. Leo hesitated. He looked at Dimitri. It was a clear dismissal. Dimitri didn't move. He met Leo's gaze, his dark eyes unyielding. I've seen worse, Leo. Let him look. A faint flush crept up Leo's neck, coloring the unbruised side of his face. He unbuttoned the remaining buttons of his ruined white shirt, pulling the fabric aside just enough to expose his left ribcage. Dimitri stopped breathing. A massive, ugly bruise was blooming across Leo's pale skin, shaped perfectly like the toe of a heavy boot. The guy hadn't just grabbed him. He had kicked him. The silence in the penthouse turned lethal. The air pressure seemed to drop. Dimitri's alpha pheromones flared, dark and furious, filling the room with the scent of possessive rage. Evans swallowed audibly, pressing gently against Leo's ribs. Nothing broken, the doctor said, his voice a little too fast. Deep tissue contusion. It's going to be painful to breathe deeply or laugh. I'll leave some painkillers. Thank you, doctor, Dmitri said. The words sounded like they were dragged over broken glass. Evans packed his bag in record time. Ivan escorted him back to the service elevator. The heavy doors closed, leaving Dmitri and Leo alone in the sprawling, quiet room. Leo slowly buttoned his shirt with his left hand, wincing as his ribs protested the movement. He pulled Dmitri's large jacket tighter around his shoulders. The scent of Dmitri's alpha pheromones clinging to the fabric seemed to calm him slightly, his own scent settling. Dmitri walked to the window, turning his back to Leo. He needed to look at the city, at the rain, at anything other than the bruise on Leo's ribs. His alpha instincts were screaming at him to do something, to hunt, to kill, to claim. You're staying here tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. Mr. Volkov, I have an apartment. I have clothes. I have an alarm set for 6:30. Cancel the alarm. You aren't going to the office tomorrow. Dmitri turned around to face him. And my name is Dmitri. You used it in the car. Keep using it. Leo looked up at him, the exhaustion finally pulling at the corners of his eyes. He didn't have the energy to fight. He leaned his head back against the sofa and closed his eyes. Fine, he whispered. Dmitri, hearing his name in that quiet, defeated tone, did something dangerous to his chest. He walked over, picked up a heavy cashmere throw from an armchair, and draped it over Leo's legs. He didn't say another word. He just sat in the armchair opposite him, watching him breathe in the dim light, and waited for the sun to come up. Leo awoke to the smell of coffee. For a disorienting second, he didn't know where he was. The ceiling was too high, the silence too absolute. Then the dull throbbing ache in his right hand and the sharp stab in his ribs provided a violent reminder. He opened his eyes. He was still on the leather sofa. Sunlight, pale and gray, filtered through the massive windows. The rain had stopped, leaving the city looking washed out and raw. He pushed himself up, biting back a groan as his ribs protested. He was still wearing his ruined shirt and Dmitri's suit jacket. He swung his legs over the side of the sofa and looked around. Dmitri was standing at the kitchen island at the far end of the open concept room. He was out of the charcoal suit, wearing dark sweatpants and a tight black t-shirt that clung to the heavy muscle of his shoulders. He was pouring coffee from a French press into two matte black mugs. His alpha scent was warm and rich, the sharp edges of last night's fury smoothed into something calmer, more controlled. He looked up as Leo moved. Sit, he called out, his voice quiet but carrying easily across the room. I'll bring it over. Leo ignored the order. He stood, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass, and walked slowly toward the kitchen. He wasn't an invalid, and he refused to be treated like one. He approached the marble island and took the mug Dmitri pushed toward him. Black, Leo said. No sugar. Exactly how you make mine. Thank you. He wrapped his good hand around the warm ceramic and took a sip. It was perfect, strong, bitter, hot. Dmitri leaned his hip against the counter, holding his own mug. He watched Leo drink, the predatory stillness that usually surrounded him muted this morning, replaced by something calculated and heavy. His name is Leo Moretti, Dmitri said abruptly. Leo froze, the mug halfway to his mouth. He slowly lowered it to the counter. You looked into it. Of course I looked into it. I don't let things like this go. Dmitri took a slow drink of his coffee. He's the nephew of Polly Moretti, the boss. Leo is stupid, careless, and has a habit of making messes his uncle has to clean up. He's currently sitting in Mercy Hospital with his jaw wired shut. Leo looked down at the dark liquid in his cup. If he's the boss's nephew, me putting him in the hospital is going to be a problem. It's my problem. No. Leo looked up, meeting Dimitri's gaze directly. It's a business problem. The Morettas have been encroaching on the south side docks for 2 months. If you retaliate violently for this, Polly will use it as an excuse to go to war over the territory. He'll claim you broke the truce over a bar fight. Dimitri narrowed his eyes. The fact that Leo knew about the Southside dock dispute wasn't entirely surprising. He managed Dimitri's schedule, he knew who he met with. The fact that he was actively analyzing street-level mob politics while standing in Dimitri's kitchen with a broken hand, however, was fascinating. So what do you suggest? Dimitri asked, testing him. Let him walk. After he put his hands on you. The anger spiked in Dimitri's voice again, hard and undeniable. I suggest you hit them where they actually feel it. Leo leaned against the marble, ignoring the twinge in his side. Leo runs their illegal sports betting operation out of the back of that meat-packing plant on 4th Street. Right? Dimitri stared at him. How do you know that? I balance your books. I notice when our street runners complain about losing foot traffic in certain neighborhoods. I pay attention. Leo took another sip of his coffee. You don't need to shoot anyone. You just need to bankrupt him. Dimitri set his mug down. He crossed his arms, giving Leo his full, undivided attention. Go on. Leo is an idiot. You said it yourself. He's definitely skimming off the top of his uncle's take. It's what entitled nephews do. Leo's voice was completely detached, analytical. The secretary was gone. A strategist had taken his place. We leak his actual betting ledgers to Polly. We prove Leo is stealing from the family. Polly is a greedy, paranoid old alpha. If he thinks his own blood is robbing him, he won't declare war on you. He'll take care of Leo himself. The penthouse was completely silent. Dimitri stared at the Omega standing in front of him. Leo's hair was a tangled mess, he had a black eye forming on his cheek, a hand wrapped in thick white gauze, and bruises blooming across his ribs. Yet he stood there with absolute authority, calmly explaining how to dismantle a rival mafia captain using forensic accounting and family paranoia. Dimitri felt a slow, dark smile pull at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of an alpha who had just found a lethal weapon he didn't know he owned. And how, exactly, do we get our hands on Leo's private ledgers? Dimitri asked softly. Leo looked at him, his dark eyes completely unreadable. I already have them. Dimitri went perfectly still. Excuse me? About 3 weeks ago, one of Leo's bookies got sloppy. Left a decrypted flash drive at a diner in our territory. Ivan brought it to the office. Didn't know what to do with it. Leo shrugged his good shoulder. I copied the files. I've been running the numbers on my lunch breaks. I built a comprehensive spreadsheet of Leo's embezzlement. I was going to put it in your Friday briefing folder. Dimitri let out a low, rough laugh. It was a sound of pure disbelief. You were going to put the financial ruin of a mafia captain in my Friday briefing folder? Between the dry cleaning receipts and the meeting notes? It seemed relevant to the business. Dimitri pushed off the counter. He walked toward Leo, closing the distance until he was standing mere inches away. Leo didn't step back. He held his ground, looking up at Dimitri. The top of his head barely reached Dimitri's collarbone. His Omega scent, usually so carefully suppressed, was flooding the space between them, warm, sweet, and laced with something that made Dimitri's alpha instincts purr. You, Dimitri murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly register, are terrifying. I'm organized, Leo corrected. Dmitri reached up. Slowly, deliberately, he brushed a stray lock of hair away from Leo's bruised cheek. His fingertips lingered on his skin, surprisingly gentle for an alpha whose hands had ended lives. The touch sent a physical jolt through Leo, a sudden spike of heat that had nothing to do with his injuries. You aren't going back to the front desk, Leo, Dmitri said, his eyes tracing the line of his jaw. When you heal, you're moving into the inner office with me. Leo looked at him, his breath hitching slightly as Dmitri's thumb grazed his cheekbone. The boundary they had shattered in the SUV was completely pulverized. There was no going back to Mr. Volkov. I'll need a new chair, Leo whispered. The one in the inner office lacks lumbar support. Dmitri smiled again. He leaned in, the scent of cedar and dark coffee wrapping around Leo. I'll buy you the whole damn building. For the next 48 hours, the penthouse became a gilded cage. Dmitri did not allow Leo to leave. He didn't lock the doors, but the implication was clear. Leo was under his protection, and his protection did not extend past the reinforced steel of the private elevator. Leo hated it. He was a creature of habit, entirely dependent on the rigid structure of his routines. Here, floating 50 stories above the city in a hypermodern vacuum, he was unmoored. His ribs ached with a dull, persistent throb. His hand, tightly bound in a fresh fiberglass splint, felt like a useless, heavy club. And the constant proximity to Dmitri's alpha pheromones was doing something to his biology that he couldn't control. His omega instincts, normally suppressed with ruthless discipline, were waking up. Every time Dmitri walked past him, Leo's body reacted. His scent sweetened. His pulse quickened. The primal part of his brain, the part he'd spent his entire adult life ignoring, was screaming at him, Alpha. Safe. Mate. It was humiliating. Dmitri, however, seemed entirely in his element. He shifted his base of operations to the penthouse dining table. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, a phone pressed to his ear, orchestrating the quiet, brutal machinery of his syndicate. Leo watched him from the sofa. He had worked for Dmitri for 3 years, but always through the filter of the outer office. He had managed the results of his orders, the payouts, the cleanups, the strategic investments. Now he was watching the genesis of those orders. Dmitri was entirely ruthless, speaking in low, measured tones that carried an absolute, undeniable authority. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stated facts, and the alphas on the other end of the line scrambled to align reality with his words. On the afternoon of the second day, Ivan arrived carrying a slim metallic briefcase. He set it on the dining table, his eyes darting briefly toward Leo, who was pretending to read a thick hardcover book on architectural history. Ivan, a beta, looked confused. The alphas in Dmitri's inner circle didn't know what to make of the Omega secretary lounging on the boss's private sofa in his sweatpants. I got it, Ivan said, tapping the briefcase. The drive. Dmitri didn't look at it. He looked at Leo. Come here. Leo closed the book and stood, moving carefully to avoid jarring his ribs. He walked over to the table and looked down at the silver case. Open it, Dmitri told Ivan. Ivan popped the latches. Inside, resting on dark foam, was a single black USB drive. Leo built the file, Dmitri said, his voice flat. Explain the drop, Ivan. Ivan shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable taking operational notes regarding the boss's Omega secretary. We got a guy inside Polly Moretti's social club in Little Italy. A busboy. He sweeps the private back room where Polly plays cards every Tuesday night. The drive gets taped under Polly's specific chair. Polly finds it, he plugs it in, he sees the spreadsheets. He sees his nephew has been stealing $250,000 a month from the sportsbooks. And the metadata? Leo asked. Ivan blinked. The what? The metadata on the files. Leo's voice returned to its familiar clipped, professional tone. If Polly's IT guys look at the creation dates, they need to see that the files were compiled on a machine registered to Leo's front company. If it traces back to one of our IP addresses, Polly will know it's a setup. Ivan looked at Dmitri. Dmitri was watching Leo with a look of quiet, intense fascination. It's clean, Dmitri said softly, answering for his lieutenant. I had the tech guys scrub it exactly how you wrote it down on the notepad this morning. Leo nodded once. Then it's ready. He plays cards at 9. He'll find it by 10. You should expect fallout by tomorrow morning. Drop it, Dmitri ordered Ivan. Ivan snapped the briefcase shut and headed for the elevator. The doors chimed, and the penthouse was plunged back into its heavy, suffocating silence. Dmitri turned his chair slightly, facing Leo. He reached out and caught his left wrist, gently pulling him closer until he was standing between Dmitri's knees. It was a deeply territorial posture, one alpha asserting dominance over an omega. Leo's breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. His scent, despite his best efforts, sweetened. You don't flinch, Dmitri murmured. He looked up into Leo's face. You just handed down a death sentence to a Mafia captain. Polly doesn't forgive theft. He'll kill his own nephew. And you didn't even blink. Leo looked down at him. The air between them felt thick, charged with the same static electricity that precedes a violent storm. Leo Moretti made a miscalculation in a bar. He assumed he held all the power. I am simply correcting his math. Dmitri let out a low sound in the back of his throat, something between a laugh and a groan. He slid his hand up Leo's arm, his thumb tracing the inside of his elbow. The touch was completely incongruous with the conversation. It was soft. Lethal men were rarely soft. You've been sitting outside my door for 3 years, Dmitri said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Handling my dry cleaning, making my coffee. And all this time you had ice in your veins. I am very good at my job, Dmitri. Your job just changed. He tightened his grip slightly, pulling Leo an inch closer. You're done answering phones. You're done managing the calendar. From now on, you sit at the table. You see the board. I don't know anything about running the streets. I know the streets, Dmitri replied, his dark eyes locking onto Leo's. You know the numbers. You see the angles. We are going to dismantle the Moretti family, Leo. And you are going to draw the blueprints. Leo swallowed hard. He was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a terrifying, pitch-black abyss. But as Dmitri's thumb slowly stroked his skin, he realized something even more frightening. He wanted to jump. The news hit the streets 48 hours later. It didn't make the morning papers. It made the whispers, the encrypted texts, the hushed conversations in the backs of butcher shops and dimly lit social clubs. Leo Moretti had been found in the trunk of a stolen sedan, parked at the long-term lot of the international airport. He had 2 bullets in the back of his head, and his hands had been severed, the traditional Cosa Nostra punishment for a thief. Uncle Paulie had cleaned his own house. Dmitri was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, watching the city wake up under a bruised purple sky. He held a cup of black coffee. He had received the call from Ivan 10 minutes ago. The plan had worked flawlessly. The Moretti crew was in chaos, bleeding from a self-inflicted wound. And Dmitri hadn't had to fire a single shot. Leo walked out of the guest bedroom. The swelling on his cheek had faded to a sickly yellow, and he was moving with more fluidity, his ribs slowly knitting back together. He was wearing a pair of Dimitri's black silk pajama pants, cinched tightly at the waist, and a grey cashmere sweater he had scavenged from Dimitri's closet. The omega scent that clung to the borrowed clothes was comforting, calming his still frayed instincts. "It's done," Dimitri said without turning around. Leo stopped near the kitchen island. He didn't ask for clarification. He knew exactly what he meant. "Has Polly reached out?" "Not yet." Dimitri took a sip of his coffee. "He's burying his blood. But he's not stupid. The timing of the ledger leak, right after Leo got his jaw broken in my territory, Polly knows I pushed the domino. He just can't prove it. And he can't retaliate, because Leo actually was stealing from him. He'll call a meeting," Leo said. It wasn't a guess. It was a calculation. Dimitri finally turned around. He looked at Leo, his expression unreadable. "He'll demand a sit-down to save face. To establish that despite the internal mess, he still holds power." "Where?" "Neutral ground. Probably the old steakhouse downtown. The ones with the private cellars." Dimitri set his mug on the glass table. "I need to get dressed." 2 hours later, the penthouse felt different. The quiet domesticity of the past few days had evaporated, replaced by cold, hard tension. Dimitri emerged from his master's suite wearing a three-piece suit the color of wet asphalt. The tailoring was flawless, designed to hide the bulk of the shoulder holster he wore underneath. His alpha pheromones were sharp and focused, the scent of a predator preparing for battle. He stood in front of the hallway mirror, struggling slightly to fasten his left cufflink. Leo watched him from the sofa. He set down the tablet he had been reading and walked over to him, his bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. "Let me," he said quietly. Dimitri dropped his hands to his sides. He turned slightly, allowing Leo into his space. Leo reached up with his good left hand, his fingers deftly manipulating the heavy silver mechanism with practiced ease. He had done this 100 times before, in the office, fixing a crooked tie or brushing lint from Dimitri's lapel before a major meeting. But this time it was different. There was no desk between them. There were no ringing phones. There was only the heavy, rhythmic sound of Dimitri's breathing and the distinct smell of gunpowder oil radiating from the weapon strapped to his ribs. Leo fastened the link and smoothed the crisp white cotton of Dimitri's cuff. He didn't pull his hand away immediately. His fingers lingered on Dimitri's wrist, feeling the slow, steady thrum of his pulse. His own scent, despite his best efforts, softened, the sweet, warm undertone of an omega in the presence of his alpha. Dimitri looked down at him. "Tell me how to play him, Leo." He wasn't testing this time. He was asking. The realization sent a shiver down Leo's spine. The most dangerous alpha in the city was asking for his strategic counsel before walking into a room full of wolves. "Polly is bleeding," Leo said, keeping his eyes on Dimitri's cuff. "He looks weak to the other families because he had to kill his own nephew. He'll try to compensate by being aggressive with you. He'll demand a concession on the south side docks. Just a sliver. Something he can take back to his captains to prove he still has teeth." "I don't give away my territory," Dimitri said, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "I know." Leo finally looked up, meeting Dimitri's dark, intense gaze. "So you offer him a phantom concession? You offer him a percentage of the freight loading fees on Pier 4? Dimitri narrowed his eyes. "Pier 4 is being condemned by the city next month for structural failure. The union is pulling all the workers out." "Exactly." Leo's voice dropped to a whisper. "But the public notices haven't been filed yet. It's buried in municipal zoning paperwork. Polly won't know. You reluctantly give him Pier 4. He walks away thinking he squeezed you. By the time he realizes he owns a piece of a rotting, condemned dock, the tension will have passed. And he won't be able to start a war over a zoning issue without looking completely incompetent. Dmitri stared at him. The absolute brilliance of it, the cold, bureaucratic violence of weaponizing city zoning laws against a mafia don, was staggering. He reached out, his large hands gripping Leo's waist, and pulled him flush against him. Leo gasped, his hands instinctively coming up to rest flat against Dimitri's chest, right over the hard leather of his holster. His omega scent flooded the space between them, sweet and desperate. "You," Dmitri murmured, his face inches from Leo's, "are a masterpiece." He didn't wait for a response. He leaned down and captured Leo's mouth. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It was 3 years of ignored tension, fueled by adrenaline and the dark, violent reality they had just plunged into together. Dimitri's mouth was hot, demanding, tasting of dark coffee and danger. His alpha pheromones wrapped around Leo like a physical force, claiming, possessing. Leo froze for a fraction of a second before kissing him back with a fierce, unexpected desperation. His good hand slid up Dimitri's chest, gripping the lapel of his suit, anchoring himself to him. The taste of Dimitri's scent flooded his senses, cedar, smoke, the sharp bite of alpha dominance, and his omega instinct screamed in approval. Dmitri groaned, a low territorial sound, backing Leo up until his shoulders hit the wall beside the mirror. He broke the kiss just enough to breathe, his lips brushing against Leo's jawline. "I'm coming back for you," he whispered roughly against Leo's skin. "Lock the elevator." The private cellar of Lombardy's steakhouse smelled of dry-aged beef, spilled Barolo, and decades of quiet corruption. The heavy oak doors were shut, guarded on the outside by 4 men who didn't speak to each other. Dmitri sat at the head of a long, scarred mahogany table. He didn't touch the glass of water in front of him. He kept his hands flat on the wood, projecting an absolute, terrifying stillness. His alpha pheromones were controlled, contained, but the faint edge of danger still radiated off him. Across from him sat Polly Moretti. The older Don looked awful. The skin around his eyes was the color of bruised plums, sagging with the heavy, inescapable weight of ordering a hit on his own blood. But Polly was a creature of pride, and grief had curdled into a vicious, unpredictable rage. He puffed on a thick cigar, the cherry glowing like a warning light in the dim room. His alpha scent was sour, curdled with grief and anger. "I cleaned up the mess," Polly said, his voice a wet rasp destroyed by years of cheap whiskey and expensive tobacco. "Leo was a thief. He stole from the family. He paid the toll. But you and I both know the timing of those ledgers hitting my desk wasn't a coincidence. You forced my hand." Dmitri didn't blink. He leaned forward just an inch. It was enough to shift the gravity in the room. "Leo put his hands on my omega. In my territory. I didn't force your hand, Polly. I did you a favor. I showed you the rat in your walls before he chewed through your foundation. You should be thanking me." Polly slammed his fist onto the table. The water glasses rattled. "You humiliated my bloodline. You think you can engineer a hit on a Moretti and walk away clean? I look weak. My captains are restless. I need balance, Dmitri. I need restitution." There it was. The demand. Dmitri felt a strange, cold thrill run through his veins. It was exactly as Leo had predicted. Every word out of the old alpha's mouth was following the script Leo had written while sitting in Dimitri's pajamas in the penthouse. "I don't pay restitution for a problem I didn't start," Dmitri said, his tone turning hard, uncompromising. "Then we go to the mattresses." Polly snarled, leaning over the table. "You think you can handle a war on 3 fronts right now? You think your alphas want to bleed over an Omega secretary? Dimitri let the silence stretch. He let Polly steep in his own adrenaline. He calculated the exact number of seconds required to make a concession look agonizing. I don't want a war over a dead thief, Dimitri finally said, lowering his voice, letting a note of manufactured reluctance bleed into his tone. The South Side docks, you've been pushing for a foothold. I'll give you Pier 4. The freight loading fees are yours. You put your own men on the gates. You collect the envelopes. We draw the line there. Polly paused. The cigar smoke drifted between them in thick, lazy coils. The older Don's eyes narrowed, searching Dimitri's face for the trick. He found nothing. Pier 4 was a high-volume dock. It was a massive concession. It was a victory Polly could take back to his crew to prove he had squeezed the untouchable Dmitri Volkov. Pier 4, Polly repeated. He leaned back in his chair, the aggressive posture dissolving into grim satisfaction. You pull your men off by midnight. Done, Dimitri said. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't offer his hand. You didn't shake hands with an alpha who had just murdered his nephew. Keep your dogs on a leash, Polly. I won't be this generous twice. Dimitri walked out of the cellar. The air in the alleyway was cold, biting through the fine wool of his suit. But it felt clean. He slid into the back of the waiting SUV. Ivan put the car in drive before the door even clicked shut. Well? Ivan asked, looking at Dimitri in the rearview mirror. She was right, Dimitri said softly, looking out at the blur of the city lights. Every single word. He took Pier 4 for Christ. Ivan shook his head. When the city drops that condemnation notice, Polly is going to have an aneurysm. Dimitri didn't respond. He just watched the rain start to fall again, his mind entirely focused on the penthouse. When the private elevator doors chimed and parted, the apartment was dark save for the ambient glow of the city filtering through the glass. Dimitri took off his suit jacket, tossing it onto an armchair. He unholstered his weapon, placing it on the console table with a heavy, metallic clack. Leo was standing by the window. He turned when he heard the gun hit the table. He was still wearing Dimitri's sweater, his dark hair falling loose over his shoulders. The bruising on his face looked stark in the low light. His Omega scent was soft, welcoming. He took it, Dimitri said. He walked across the room, stopping 2 feet away from Leo. He took Pier 4. He thinks he won. Leo let out a slow, controlled breath. The tension that had been holding his spine rigid finally snapped, leaving him suddenly exhausted. It buys us time. At least a month before the zoning board makes the filings public. It buys us leverage, Dimitri corrected. He closed the remaining distance between them, reaching out with his large hands to cup Leo's face. He didn't care about the bruises. He didn't care about the bandages. He looked at Leo like he was the only real thing in a city made of ghosts. You did this, he murmured, his thumbs tracing the line of Leo's cheekbones. You broke a Mafia family with a zoning ordinance. Leo looked up into Dimitri's dark, violent eyes. The fear he should have felt was completely absent, replaced by a dark, terrifying rush of adrenaline. He reached up with his good hand, curling his fingers into the soft cotton of Dimitri's shirt. Dimitri leaned down and kissed him. It was slower this time. Heavier. It was a seal on a contract they had both silently agreed to. Leo kissed him back, letting the cold logic of his mind shut down, surrendering to the brutal, undeniable heat of the alpha holding him. His Omega instincts, finally free of suppression, sang in approval. Dimitri pulled back just enough to look at Leo's face. His pupils were blown wide, his scent thick and sweet. You're sent, Dmitri murmured, his voice rough. It's changing. You're... Don't, Leo said, his voice catching. Don't say it. But it was true. Leo could feel it too. The bond was forming, deepening, the Omega in him recognizing the Alpha who had claimed him in every way that mattered. His body was responding, preparing itself for a marking that hadn't happened yet but was inevitable. Dimitri's hands slid down to Leo's waist, pulling him closer. You're mine, he said, his voice a low growl. Say it. Leo's breath hitched. I'm yours. The words tasted like surrender. Like victory. Dmitri kissed him again, deeper this time, and Leo felt something inside him click into place. The bond. It was there, shimmering at the edges of his consciousness, a connection that would only grow stronger with time. Tomorrow, Dmitri said against his lips, we start dismantling the rest of them. Together. Leo nodded, his forehead resting against Dimitri's. Together. Monday morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving glare of a clear sky. When Dimitri's black SUV pulled up to the curb outside the Volkov corporate tower, the atmosphere shifted. Ivan opened the rear door. Dmitri stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his navy suit. Then he turned and offered his hand to the dark interior. Leo stepped onto the pavement. He wasn't wearing gray slacks and a pressed white button-down. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, the cut sharp enough to draw blood. His hair was pulled back into its usual severe clasp, but the thick black-rimmed sunglasses he wore to hide the fading yellow bruise on his cheek gave him an entirely different aura. His right hand was still encased in the white fiberglass splint. He ignored Dimitri's hand. He didn't need help standing. They walked into the lobby together. The security guards, the receptionists, the low-level runners disguised as couriers, everyone stopped. They were used to seeing Leo trailing 2 steps behind Dmitri, carrying a tablet and a coffee. Today he walked beside him. The physical distance between them had vanished. They moved as a single, cohesive unit. And their sense, Dimitri's sharp alpha dominance, Leo's sweet omega submission, were intertwined. The bond between them was invisible, but everyone in that lobby could feel it. Leo Chen was no longer just the secretary. He was the Alpha's Omega. He was untouchable. The elevator ride to the executive floor was completely silent. Ivan stood in the corner, his eyes fixed firmly on the floor indicator. He had seen the way Dmitri looked at Leo over the weekend. The men in the crew weren't idiots. The hierarchy had shifted violently and permanently. The doors opened. Leo's old desk sat in the center of the reception area. It was spotless. His favorite pen was exactly where he had left it on Thursday afternoon. He didn't even look at it. He walked straight past the laminate desk and followed Dmitri through the heavy double doors into the inner sanctum. Dimitri's office was massive, paneled in dark walnut, smelling of leather and old paper. He walked behind his sprawling executive desk and sat down. He pointed to the heavy round mahogany table situated in the corner of the room, overlooking the harbor. A new ergonomic chair sat behind it. Stacked neatly in the center of the table were 6 thick leather-bound ledgers, the real books, the numbers that dictated the life and death of the Volkov syndicate. The laundering fronts in the garment district are bleeding cash, Dmitri said, booting up his computer. He didn't look at Leo. It was pure business. The shell corporations are structured wrong. Find the leak. Fix it. Leo walked over to the table. He sat down in the new chair. The lumbar support was, in fact, excellent. He pulled the first ledger toward him, flipping it open with his good hand. I'll need the tax ID numbers for the trucking subsidiaries, he replied, his voice cold, professional, and entirely devoid of hesitation. For the next 4 hours, the only sounds in the inner office were the scratching of Dimitri's pen and the quiet clicking of Leo's left hand on a calculator. It was an incredibly intimate silence. They were dissecting the anatomy of a criminal empire together. Leo found 3 critical vulnerabilities in the offshore accounts before lunch. Dimitri approved his restructuring plan with a single nod. He trusted his Omega's intellect completely. At 1:30 p.m., the heavy wooden doors swung open without a knock. Ivan walked in, his face the color of wet cement. He didn't look at Leo. He walked straight to Dimitri's desk and planted his hands on the edge. "We have a problem," Ivan said. His voice was tight, strung tight with panic. Dimitri set his pen down slowly. "Report. The city." Ivan swallowed hard. A reporter for the Tribune got a leak from the zoning board. They published the condemnation notices early. Front page of the Metro section online. Pier 4 is officially dead paper as of an hour ago. The silence in the office turned instantly toxic. Leo stopped calculating. His left hand hovered over the keypad. The timeline was wrong. The municipal filings weren't supposed to hit the public register until the end of the month. A leak, someone at the zoning board had gotten greedy and sold the tip to a journalist. Dimitri didn't move. His face was a mask carved from stone. "Has Polly seen it?" Polly's guys were down at the pier setting up their lockboxes when the union boss walked up with a printout of the article and told them to get off the property. Ivan said grimly. "Polly knows. He knows you handed him a rotting corpse and told him it was a gold mine." Dimitri leaned back in his leather chair. He looked across the room at Leo. His Omega met his gaze. The analytical part of Leo's brain, the part that organized chaos into neat, manageable columns, was already spinning. The trap had sprung too early. Polly hadn't had time to cool down from Leo's death. The humiliation was fresh, public, and undeniable. "He's going to hit back," Leo said, his voice cutting through the heavy air. "He can't call another meeting. It makes him look weak twice. He has to respond with violence." "Where?" Dimitri asked. He didn't ask Ivan. He asked the Omega sitting at the mahogany table. "The garment district fronts," Leo said instantly, looking down at the ledgers he had just spent 4 hours analyzing. "We just identified the vulnerabilities. If I can see the structural weakness in those warehouses, Polly's accountants can too. It's where our cash is most exposed." Dimitri looked at Ivan. "Pull every man off the south side. Consolidate them at the garment warehouses. Lock down the blocks. Nobody gets in or out without my explicit order. Boss, if we pull the muscle off the south side, we leave the casinos completely exposed," Ivan argued, his voice rising. "Do it, Ivan." Dimitri snapped, the volume of his voice cracking like a whip. "Now." Ivan turned and practically ran out of the office, pulling his phone from his pocket. Dimitri stood up. He walked over to the corner of his office, opened a hidden compartment in the walnut paneling, and pulled out a matte black tactical shotgun. He checked the chamber with a brutal, mechanical efficiency. His alpha pheromones flooded the room, dark and furious, the scent of a predator about to strike. Leo watched him. The reality of the life he had just chosen was stripping away its clean mathematical veneer. It was turning into blood and cordite. But he didn't flinch. His Omega instincts, instead of cowering, were humming in approval. His alpha was preparing to defend what was his. What was theirs? Dimitri walked over to Leo's table. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of Leo's chair, boxing him in. His eyes were entirely black, consumed by the violence that was about to break over the city. "You don't leave this room," Dimitri ordered, his voice a lethal whisper. "You lock the doors." You don't open them for anyone but me. Leo looked up at him. He didn't tremble. He reached up, his fingers grazing the hard line of Dimitri's jaw. Don't miss. The heavy walnut doors clicked shut. The deadbolt slid into place with a sickening finality. Leo sat in the absolute quiet of the inner office. The silence was heavier now, pressing against the thick glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Below him, the city moved in ignorant, rhythmic pulses, completely unaware of the violence spooling up in its concrete arteries. He looked at the leather ledgers stacked neatly on the mahogany table. Dimitri had told him to wait. Dimitri had told him to lock the doors. Leo was not an Omega who simply waited. He pulled his laptop forward. His right hand throbbed beneath the fiberglass splint, a steady, rhythmic ache that ironically sharpened his focus. He opened the encrypted financial network Dimitri used to move millions across international borders. If Paulie Moretti was hitting the garment district, he was committing heavy resources, men, weapons, vehicles, silence. They all required immediate liquid cash. You didn't run a street war on credit. You paid up front, or men didn't pull the trigger. Leo's left hand flew across the keyboard. He didn't have the authority to order hits. He couldn't fire a shotgun. But he had the routing numbers. It took him 22 minutes to bypass the secondary firewalls on the holding accounts Paulie used to pay his street captains. The digital architecture was sloppy. Leo Moretti had been skimming from these exact accounts for months, which meant the internal security protocols had been quietly degraded to hide his theft. Leo didn't steal the money. That would trigger immediate banking alerts and tracebacks. Instead, he drafted a string of complex fabricated tax liens using dummy shell corporations. He injected them into the banking mainframe and flagged Paulie's primary accounts for suspected federal fraud. The automated banking algorithms did the rest, acting with ruthless, emotionless efficiency. Within seconds, Paulie Moretti's primary operational funds were frozen, pending an automatic 90-day federal review. Leo hit the enter key. The screen flashed a sterile green confirmation banner. Down on the streets, Paulie's war chest had just evaporated. For miles away, the garment district smelled of diesel exhaust and damp asphalt. Dimitri stood in the deep shadow of an alleyway, the tactical shotgun heavy and familiar in his hands. Ivan was crouched 10 feet away behind a rusted industrial dumpster, gripping a matte black rifle. The rain had started again, a fine freezing mist that slicked the cobblestones. The convoy of unmarked cargo vans arrived exactly when Leo's vulnerability assessment dictated they would. They aggressively pulled up to the loading docks of Dimitri's primary laundering warehouse, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. Dimitri didn't wait for them to deploy. He didn't give a speech. He stepped out of the shadows and fired. The first blast shattered the engine block of the lead van. The sound was deafening, a physical force that cracked the heavy humid air and echoed violently off the brick facades. Chaos erupted. Paulie's men scrambled out of the crippled vehicles, returning fire blindly into the dark. But Dimitri's crew had the high ground, the angles, and the element of total surprise. It wasn't a prolonged battle. It was a tactical execution. Dimitri moved with a terrifying mechanical grace. He didn't waste movement. He didn't waste ammunition. He was the violent, unavoidable consequence of an old alpha's pride. A stray bullet grazed the fabric of his suit jacket, biting a chunk of brick out of the wall behind him. He didn't flinch. He racked the shotgun, stepped smoothly out from cover, and fired again. Within 4 minutes, the street was quiet. The surviving Moretti forces dropped their weapons and ran, abandoning the smoking vans and their wounded. Ivan walked over to the nearest vehicle, kicking a dropped handgun into the storm drain with a dull splash. "We hold the line," Dimitri commanded, his voice perfectly steady over the ringing in his ears. "Clean this up." If Polly sends a second wave, break them. Dimitri didn't stay to watch the cleanup. He turned and walked back to the waiting SUV. He had to get back to the tower. The digital clock on Leo's desk read 4:17 p.m. A heavy brass handle on the double doors turned. The deadbolt clicked open. Leo stood up. Dimitri walked in. He looked exactly the same as when he had left, except for a dusting of white brick powder on his left shoulder and the harsh, metallic scent of fired rounds clinging to the wool of his suit. He placed the shotgun on his desk. He looked across the vast room at Leo. He didn't ask if he was okay. He could see that he was perfectly fine. They hit the loading docks, Dimitri said, his voice a low gravel drag. They didn't get inside. It's over. I know, Leo replied calmly. He closed his laptop with a soft snap. Polly just received an automated notification from his bankers. His primary operating accounts are locked down under federal suspicion. He can't pay the men who just survived your ambush. By tomorrow morning, his captains will defect to avoid a war they aren't getting paid to fight. Dimitri stopped halfway across the room. He stared at Leo. The residual adrenaline of the gunfight slowly drained from his system, replaced by a profound, overwhelming awe. He walked to the mahogany table. He didn't box Leo in this time. He reached out and gently took his uninjured left hand, pulling him slowly around the table until he was standing flush against his chest. You froze his accounts, Dimitri whispered, the realization settling heavily over him. I flagged them, Leo corrected softly, looking up into Dimitri's dark eyes. The money is still there. He just can't touch it. I starved his army. Dimitri let out a ragged breath. He rested his forehead against Leo's. The bond between them, shimmering and new, pulsed with warmth. He had spent his entire life surrounded by men who claimed loyalty, men who fought with muscle and steel. He had never met anyone who fought with such cold, devastating precision. We broke him, Dimitri said, his hands sliding down to rest heavily on Leo's waist. We corrected the market, Leo replied, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips for the very first time. Dimitri kissed him. It wasn't the desperate collision of before. It was a slow, deep claim. It tasted like survival. Leo leaned into him, the throbbing in his hand and the ache in his ribs fading into the background. He was no longer just the secretary. He was the architect. And the Alpha King of the city was holding him like he was the only crown that mattered. And that is how you conquer a city. Not just with bullets and bravado, but with ledgers, logic, and an Omega who refuses to be collateral damage. Dimitri and Leo's dynamic had completely shifted, from the front desk to the throne, proving that the most lethal weapon in the criminal underworld isn't a gun. It's a brilliant mind, bound by a bond that makes them unstoppable. The days that followed were a blur of consolidation. Leo's financial restructures plugged the leaks in the garment district. Dimitri's lieutenants, initially skeptical of the Omega's influence, quickly learned to respect the sharp mind behind the quiet demeanor. More importantly, they learned to fear what happened when someone underestimated him. Polly Moretti's organization crumbled from within. His captains, unpaid and disillusioned, either defected to Dimitri's ranks or disappeared into the wind. Polly himself was found 3 weeks later in his social club, a single bullet in his head and a note pinned to his chest that simply read, Pier 4. The message was clear. One night, weeks after the dust had settled, Dimitri came home to find Leo standing by the window, silhouetted against the glittering city skyline. The penthouse was quiet, the rain finally stilled. Leo turned as Dimitri approached. The splint on his hand had been replaced by a smaller brace. The bruises on his face had faded to faint echoes. He looked more powerful than Dimitri had ever seen him. You're brooding, Leo said. I don't brood. I plan. You were staring at the window. That's brooding. Dmitri smiled, a rare, genuine expression that softened the hard lines of his face. He walked over and wrapped his arms around Leo from behind, pulling him close. The Omega's scent was warm, sweet, utterly intoxicating. The bond between them hummed with contentment. What are you planning? Leo asked, leaning back against his chest. Expansion. The docks. The casinos. The whole East Side. Dmitri pressed a kiss to Leo's temple. But that's for tomorrow. Tomorrow, Leo echoed. He turned in Dmitri's arms, looking up at him. Is that what you call it when we're operating on 3 hours of sleep and enough caffeine to kill a horse? Stamina is a virtue. Leo snorted. It's a biological imperative. You're an alpha. Your body doesn't understand the concept of rest. Dmitri's eyes darkened. His hands slid down to Leo's hips, pulling him flush against him. You want to talk about biology, Omega? Leo's breath hitched. His sense sweetened, the bond between them flaring with sudden heat. I want to talk about getting some sleep. You sleep. I'll watch. You always say that. Leo's voice was soft, amused. And you always end up. Dmitri kissed him, cutting off the words. It was gentler than before, a slow, deliberate exploration of everything they had built together. Leo melted into him, his hands fisting in Dmitri's shirt, the bond between them pulsing with warmth and desire. When they broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Mark me, Leo whispered. Dmitri went still. What? Mark me. Leo's voice was steady, resolved. I want it. I want everyone to know. I want you to know. I'm yours. I've been yours since you walked into that precinct. Dmitri stared at him. The request was everything he had wanted, everything he had been too afraid to ask for. He reached up, his hand cupping Leo's jaw, tilting his head to expose the pale skin of his throat. You know what this means, Dmitri said, his voice rough. Once I do this, there's no going back. You're mine. Forever. Leo looked at him, his dark eyes glowing with fierce certainty. I've been yours since you threw your jacket over my shoulders and told me I was staying. Mark me. Make it permanent. Dmitri didn't hesitate. He leaned down and bit down on the juncture of Leo's neck and shoulder, sinking his teeth into the soft skin. The bond flared to life, searing and electric, wrapping around them both. Leo cried out, his body arching against Dmitri's, his Omega instincts roaring in approval. The bite sealed the bond, cementing them together for the rest of their lives. When Dmitri pulled back, the mark was already beginning to heal. It would scar, pale and permanent, a visible sign that Leo was claimed. That he was Dmitri's. Beautiful, Dmitri murmured, tracing the mark with his thumb. You're beautiful. Leo's scent was thick and sweet, his body trembling with spent adrenaline. He looked up at Dmitri, his eyes soft, vulnerable in a way they never were in the office. I love you, Leo whispered. I don't know when it happened. It just did. You became everything. Dmitri pulled him into his arms, holding him tight. The bond thrummed between them, warm and alive. I love you too, he said against Leo's hair. I think I always have. I just didn't know it. For a long moment, they stood there, wrapped in each other, the city glittering below them. The criminal empire stretched out at their feet, but in that moment, none of it mattered. Come on, Dmitri said finally, pulling back just enough to take Leo's hand. Let's get some sleep. Tomorrow, we have a city to run. Leo smiled, his hand gripping Dmitri's. Together. Together. They walked toward the bedroom, their scents intertwined, the bond between them singing with life and power. The city could wait. For now, they had everything they needed. And that is how you build an empire. Not with blood and fear alone, but with trust, loyalty, and an Omega who refused to be anything less than equal. The Volkov Syndicate would never be the same. And neither would its leaders.